But Edward, the new King Edward VII, was already 59 years old. The funeral of the Queen Empress and Edward's coronation involved a huge invention of traditions and ceremonies. And in this atmosphere, it's not surprising that Edward was granted an annual allowance even greater than Victoria's. A few voices said that it was unnecessary for the king to have as big an income as Andrew Carnegie, the Bill Gates of his day, but no one took much notice. Edward had been given a miserable and oppressive childhood. Victoria had measured him by the impossible yardstick of her hero worship of the perfect man, his father. Naturally, young Bertie had rebelled. Of course, his first visit to a prostitute shocked his parents deeply. It happened to be followed by Albert's fatal illness, which Victoria had inevitably blamed on her wicked son. She had arranged his marriage shortly afterwards in the hope that domestic discipline would rein him in. Princess Alex of Denmark was beautiful, but she was also deaf and dull company. With nothing much else to do, Bertie had become the living epitome of the life of the Belle Epoque. A life of champagne drinking, cigar smoking, horse racing, gambling and entertaining showgirls and pretty married ladies. He was naturally drawn to the company of outsiders, not just shady characters, but Jews and Catholics, bankers and foreigners, and he was outspokenly outraged by the casual racism of the empire. Because a man has a black face and a different religion than our own, there is no reason why he should be treated as a brute. He sat on a commission on working-class housing and even invited a member of the working class to stay at Sandringham. Admittedly, the man in question was an MP and a fellow member of the commission, and he had to eat in his bedroom because he didn't have the right clothes to come down to dinner. But still... By the time Edward came to the throne, he was a big, fat old man with a social conscience and a comforting mistress, Alice Keppel, who understood him perfectly. Edward saw himself as something like a nursery rhyme monarch, magnificent and jolly, caring and helpful. In 1903, completely ignoring his government, he went to France and started negotiations for a treaty that would become the Entente Cordiale, isolating Germany. He detested his nephew, the Kaiser. He persuaded the press and then the government to back a treaty which guaranteed that if Germany attacked France, Britain would go to war. So that's what happened in 1914. He determinedly resisted any increase in democracy in Britain and was a firm opponent of votes for women. The crunch over his reactionary views came when Lloyd George planned to introduce old age pensions in 1909. To raise the cash, there would have to be new taxes on income. The Tory majority in the House of Lords voted down what was called the People's Budget, and when the Liberal government drew up legislation to take that power away from the Lords, they voted that down too, obviously. So the Prime Minister told the King he needed to create about 250 new peers to swing the vote. Edward was not enthusiastic. Would he actually defy the government? In May 1910, in the middle of the battle, he died. He was the late King's second son. He'd worked as a commander in the Navy, to which he was deeply attached. But in 1892, his elder brother Clarence had died, and he'd unexpectedly become heir. To step into his brother's shoes, he'd left his job and married the woman who'd been betrothed to Clarence, a relative called Princess Mary of Teck. He now inherited a fortune worth around 140 million in today's prices, and a political crisis. As part of the deal with the government to pass the budget and cut the powers of the House of Lords, it was agreed that the Crown could stop paying any income tax. In return, the King would pay for his own trips abroad. The new constitutional deal drew the teeth of the House of Lords. Whatever the elected government in the Commons decided to do, it now could do. The only possible break on its power was now the King, and the question was, of course, whether he would ever exercise it, and what would happen if he tried. At first, the crown was too weak to try. When war began with Germany in 1914, George was seen, naturally enough, as a German, which he was. He kept a bit quiet about his courtesy titles of Field Marshal General of the Prussian Army and Admiral of the Imperial German Navy. To make himself seem more British and therefore more secure, in July 1917, George felt forced to change his family name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor and stop being a German prince and Duke of Saxony. Revolution was a real danger. Cousin Nicky, the Tsar of Russia, was deposed in February 1917. The new Russian government asked Britain to give him asylum, and Lloyd George agreed to it. But King George was terrified of being associated with a man now labeled tyrant by revolutionaries, so he forced the government to withdraw the offer. The Bolsheviks took over Russia in October, and Nicholas and his family were slaughtered. To protect the king's reputation, it was put about that Lloyd George had refused to rescue them, despite the king's pleading. Then in November 1918, a German revolution forced the Kaiser, Cousin Willie, to abdicate, and Germany gave up the war. The whole political landscape had been transformed. There had been 6 emperors when George was crowned. By 1925, he was the only one left, and his world was not exactly safe. Most of the Southern Irish were committed Republicans. Attempts to hold that country by force were disastrous, and in 1922 the Irish Free State had come into being. King George had lost a considerable chunk of his kingdom. The wealth of the royal family continued to grow, due largely to Queen Mary's enthusiasm for collecting valuable trinkets at special prices. The Romanovs hadn't been allowed to join the British royals, but a substantial chunk of their jewellery did.
That's my cigarette charger.
People began hiding their treasures if the Queen was coming to call, as she would hint strongly that she expected to be given them. Sometimes take them anyway, so that embarrassed aides had to quietly return later. In 1924, Ramsay MacDonald became Britain's first Labour Prime Minister. The old political establishment had been given a kicking. No one knew where this might lead. And then came the Wall Street crash of 1929 and financial disaster. The government needed huge loans, which were conditional on cuts in unemployment benefit and the pay of public servants and the armed forces. The Labour cabinet wouldn't do it, and MacDonald went to the king to resign. George was pretty sure this was a decisive moment. If these harsh policies were forced through by conservatives, class war would probably break out. Everything, including himself, might very well be swept away. So he refused to accept the resignation. He persuaded Ramsay MacDonald that it was his patriotic duty to stay on as the leader of a new coalition government to force through the cuts. That way, they were more likely to be accepted. This was an extraordinary exercise of royal power, and it wasn't over yet. When the cuts were announced in September 1931, the entire Atlantic Fleet went on strike. This was the most powerful military force in the world, and it was gathered at Invergordon. There was total panic in the Admiralty. Mutiny! The intelligence services warned that it was a communist plot and that the sailors were going to march to London, rallying all the disaffected, including the police, on the way. The financial markets went into a tailspin, and the Bank of England was forced to stop exchanging pounds for gold, going off the gold standard. The Admiralty drew up plans to bombard the mutinous fleet from the land and sink its own ships. And the king decided he had to save the navy and the country. He knew sailors. They weren't revolutionaries. They just needed to be spoken to in the right way. In complete secrecy, he took control, appointing a retired admiral to deal with the situation. Admiral John Kelly was not appointed by the government or the Admiralty and was instructed not to report to them, but directly to King George. He offered the sailors a deal. If they sailed back to their home ports, the king would see to it that their grievances were taken seriously and they would not be punished. It was a sensible approach, and it worked. But all evidence of the king's role and Kelly's appointment was hidden. We're not supposed to know what power royalty can wield. Of course, the bit about mutineers not being punished was a lie. Once the danger was past, the leaders were identified and quietly removed. The following year, 1932, King George gave the first Christmas radio message. He was now a presence in homes throughout his empire. The empire had changed its form, of course, and in 1931 the dominions, the white bits of the empire, Canada, Australia and so on, had become legally independent of Westminster. They were the Commonwealth, and the sovereign was its institutional core. As part of his program to make the monarchy seem British, and so he hoped more secure, he decreed that his children need not marry partners of royal descent. This would indeed transform the position of the monarchy, but not in the way he expected. In 1936, when George was 70 and dying, his doctor, Lord Dawson, decided to ensure that the death would not be reported first in the vulgar evening papers. You've heard of Lord Dawson of Penn. He's killed any number of men. And that's why we sing, "Oh God Save the King," from Bertrand Lord Dawson of Penn. Lord Dawson met the Times' deadline by giving the king a fatal injection, called a whiz-bang. George was told he would soon be convalescing in Bognor. His last words were, "Bugger Bognor." The Times was told he'd said, "How is the Empire?" Edward was 38, the poorly educated child of rather dysfunctional parents. The Queen had been completely distant, and King George famously said, "My father was frightened of his father, I was frightened of my father, and I'm damn well going to see to it that my children are frightened of me." Edward had escaped by travelling widely, and as the world's most eligible bachelor enjoyed affairs with a number of married women, culminating in the love of his life, the twice-married, elegant American Wallis Simpson. At the time of Edward's succession, the affair was in full swing, and her husband had resigned himself to a divorce. The British press completely censored the whole subject, while the rest of the world was fascinated by it. Edward insisted that he was going to marry Wallis and make her queen. The Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury said the country wouldn't stand for it. Were they right? Probably not. Edward was actually pretty popular. He wanted to go on the radio and appeal to the nation, but he wasn't allowed to do that. He was told it would be unconstitutional. Without a written document, the Constitution is what the government can get away with. They had their reasons. These went beyond the court gossip that Wallis was said to be a lesbian or a man engaged in a sadomasochistic relationship with Edward. The crucial issue wasn't even that the head of the church shouldn't marry a divorcee, or that secret investigators had reported that Wallis Simpson had 2 other lovers, a car salesman and an Irish peer. The real reason only came to light in 2002. Secret documents show that the FBI told the British government that Wallis had another lover, the German ambassador von Ribbentrop. In fact, the FBI said she was a Nazi agent. That was why the government insisted Edward must give her up to keep the throne. Edward chose love rather than the crown. He abdicated and took Mrs. Simpson to live in France. The coronation went ahead, but with his brother Albert sitting on the throne. Albert was crowned as King George VI. He was 18 months younger than Edward and completely lacked his brother's social grace. He stammered, he was shy, but at least he was safely married to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the daughter of a minor Scottish aristocrat, the first royal to legally marry a commoner since Henry VIII. George VI and Queen Elizabeth, that's the woman we remember as Elizabeth the Queen Mother, refused to allow themselves any doubt as to the outcome of the Second World War. When Buckingham Palace was bombed, the Queen said she was glad. It meant she could look the East End in the face. At least it meant the royal couple wouldn't be booed anymore when they visited other people's bombed-out homes. Actually, while they spent their days in London, they retreated for the night to Windsor, which was considerably safer. Nevertheless, they did have one really narrow escape. As the war went on, the royal couple became more and more identified with Churchill as the spirit of Britain, dogged in their determination to see Nazism defeated. When the victory celebrations came in 1945, it seemed natural that they should revolve around Buckingham Palace. By the time of his premature death from smoking in 1952, this shy country gentleman and his queen had gone a very long way to restoring the monarchy to its central place in British life. It had vanished virtually everywhere else. There had been 16 monarchies on the continent of Europe when Victoria died. Now there was only Sweden. Monarchs were restored to Belgium, Holland, Norway, and Denmark, but as a pale shadow of the old European royalty.
This summer, Britons have been celebrating 50 years of Elizabeth II's reign. Like kings and queens before her, this queen has understood that public display, being seen, is crucial to the survival of the monarchy. But although year after year she strikes just the right note, there are times when she gets it spectacularly wrong. Only 5 years ago, the royal response to the death of Princess Diana was badly mishandled. The Queen appeared unable to share in the nation's grief. At no time had she looked more vulnerable. The monarchy itself appeared out of touch. Under siege from snapping cameras and the tabloid press, Elizabeth II has faced a challenge quite unlike any of her predecessors. And it's this: in an age of relative peace and prosperity, greater social equality, and enormous technological change, how does she avoid becoming simply part of the heritage industry? Can she convince us that she and her successors really matter? She was born here at a house on Bruton Street in London's Mayfair on April the 21st, 1926 at 2:40 in the morning. Outside, a great crowd milling around, eager to get its first glimpse of the new princess, who would be third in line for the throne. But back then, it was accepted that Britain needed its monarchy. Since then, during Elizabeth's reign, the monarchies had to fight to justify its existence, to prove that it's still relevant to modern Britain. It was from her aging grandfather, George V, that the 9-year-old Elizabeth took her first lessons in monarchy. Grandpa England, as she called him, knew that monarchs need to show themselves to their people. Henry II had done it, so had Henry V. In fact, it was medieval kings who invented royal pageantry. George V understood that history. World War I had given him every chance to show that the monarch, even if he had little power, could seriously serve as a morale-boosting symbol for his people, and it had made him enormously popular. Not since the days of Queen Victoria had a monarch been held in such high esteem, and some of the public's love rubbed off on the young Elizabeth. When she was seen riding with the old king in his coach, people said that she was both beautiful and dignified. And yet, would beauty and dignity be enough? In the 1930s, communicating with the public was beginning to mean more than parades. Britain was now entering the broadcasting age. Elizabeth got some useful advice from an unexpected source. As a young girl, Elizabeth came for some tutorials here at Eton College. The provost or headmaster impressed upon her that broadcasting must be one of the prime duties of a modern monarch. Elizabeth's father, George VI, had accepted the duty to broadcast regularly to his people, but it had been agony for him. He was a very private man who never wanted to become king. Nervous, dogged by a stammer, he'd come to the throne in 1936 with great reluctance. Once again, times of trouble helped the monarchy. The Second World War gave the king a crucial public role to play. Carefully staged managed visits to blitzed areas of London bolstered the nation's fighting spirit and the standing of the king, as did widely circulated pictures of his daughters. Elizabeth, heir to the throne, added grace to any royal appearance. As the war ended, the future queen had to be seen to marry the right person. Philip, the handsome young Prince of Greece, was not the most obvious suitor. He had distinguished himself in the war, but he hadn't gone to Eton. People said there was a hint of the gold digger about him, that he was a socialite and a foreigner. Above all, he had progressive ideas. But Elizabeth thought differently. She was in love. Philip was unquestionably blue-blooded, and any official concerns were eventually smoothed over. The public were in favour, as they demonstrated when they lined the route from the palace to Westminster Abbey on the royal wedding day in November 1947. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish and to adore. Next, the people expected a royal baby, and they weren't disappointed. Whilst Philip was away, playing squash, Charles was born at Buckingham Palace in 1948. A daughter, Anne, followed in 1950. Married life suited the young princess, but she was troubled by the knowledge that her father's health was failing. He'd contracted lung cancer. Elizabeth now had to learn the job of sovereign. She started to attend parliamentary debates and to read government papers. Then, in 1952, the moment arrived. The royal family had allowed themselves to believe that George VI would get better. It had been decided that Philip and Elizabeth, on behalf of the King and the Queen, should undertake a royal tour to Kenya. The King was well enough to see them off at the airport. Everything seemed fine. In fact, that was the last Elizabeth saw of her father. 1 week later, on the 6th of February, he died in his sleep. Elizabeth was staying in the Treetops Hotel. As was noted at the time, she became queen while perched in a tree in Africa. The coronation was planned for June 1953, and the country was eager to see the event. From the beginning, there was a struggle between those who thought broadcasting it would be good for the monarchy and those who didn't. Some palace officials thought that it might stop people coming to London, and that viewing the Queen on television was undignified. They were horrified at the thought that she'd be watched by people who were improperly dressed, in their shirt sleeves, or slurping a mug of coffee. In the event, they needn't have worried. 1.5 million new televisions were bought, but over 1 million people crowded outside Westminster Abbey. immense popularity of the coronation was followed by a hugely successful tour of the Commonwealth. Over 5 months, Elizabeth and Philip went from country to country until they ended up in Australia, where it was claimed that 3/4 of the population turned out to see them. The enthusiasm was unprecedented. Old soldiers came up to the Queen and said, "Now I know what I fought for." But this was no showbiz parade. It was royal diplomacy, bringing countries together by means of highly publicised tours and proving that the monarch could act as a key player on the world stage. But these were the easy years, when Elizabeth's popularity seemed unassailable. The new Queen could never anticipate just how difficult it was going to be to gauge the mood of a nation and to manage her royal image. This year, millions turned out for the Queen, much as they did in Australia after the coronation. But back in 1960s Britain, there was a growing feeling that the Queen was rather detached, a bit slow to catch on to the national mood. 1966 saw the disaster in Aberfan in South Wales, when a slag heap engulfed the local school and 146 people were killed, 81 of them children. Prince Philip visited the village immediately, as did the Prime Minister, but the Queen held back, saying she didn't want to obstruct the rescue operation. This was a bad mistake. Her father and grandfather had turned out for the bereaved of 2 world wars. Where was the Queen when her country needed her? Eventually, 6 days later, she went, and as a mother now of 4 children, was genuinely overwhelmed by the tragedy of what she saw. Bereaved villagers recalled how sympathetic she was to their plight. Her public image recovered, but only just. Aberfan was a turning point. If the Queen was to maintain the affections of her people, a charm offensive was needed. Earlier monarchs had deployed armies, conquered the nation by force. For Elizabeth, her weapon was the media, but it would prove to be a double-edged sword. The result was a series of promotional events designed to increase public awareness of the Queen and show her greater openness to public interest. A ceremony was held to invest Charles as Prince of Wales. In truth, the pageantry for this was largely made up, but it had the semblance of age-old tradition.
Charles, Prince of Wales, to become your liege man of life and limb.
This was royalty as the country wanted it.
Faith and truth I will bear unto thee, to live and die against all manner of folks.
At Greenwich, the Queen also knighted the yachtsman Francis Chichester, using the very sword with which Elizabeth I had knighted Francis Drake. But the key event was Royal Family, a behind-the-scenes documentary broadcast in 1969. Some commentators say this film, which is rarely allowed to be seen nowadays, started the rot of intrusive press interest. It wasn't so much that the royal family gave too much away, but that the palace expected the press to be grateful and to leave the Queen alone. Press wanted more. Next, the spotlight fell on the Queen's finances. Royal expenditure has been a thorny problem since William the Conqueror first made Saxon smallholders accountable to the king's purse. In the 20th century, there was a growing feeling that the palace should justify its money. Inflation had hit the royal family, but no one had much sympathy with Prince Philip saying he'd sold a yacht and might have to give up polo. After all, they had private fortunes, and if they wanted public money, they should be seen to be doing a good job. Palace officials were keen to tell us how hard the Queen worked. She has public duties all around the country, they said. She receives 120 letters a day, spends 3 hours reading government documents, and then there are the tours abroad and entertaining visiting heads of state. When it came to some other members of the royal family, however, value for money was less obvious. Princess Margaret came under criticism in the 1970s when she was seen living it up on the island of Mustique. It was said she'd cut her public engagements by half. So the royals were caught in a double bind. They were failing to provide the model of family life the public expected, and there was growing concern about their secret wealth.
But in 1977, it was the Queen's Silver Jubilee, and what a great success that was. 4,000 street parties in London alone, which just goes to show how contradictory public opinion could be. People might grumble about the Queen's aloofness. They might complain of royal extravagance and bad behaviour by some of the royals. But give them a chance to participate in the pageantry and to celebrate the reign, they jumped at it.
But the Queen would not bask in the glow of unifying the people for long. By the 1980s, the whole approach to royal reporting had become a free-for-all. Lady Diana Spencer became a star overnight, and after her marriage to Prince Charles, the Queen met with newspaper editors and pleaded for restraint. Her words fell on deaf ears. Diana was besieged. Lady Diana Spencer, there's no doubt that Diana herself enjoyed this media attention. She used it to promote her charities, the things that she felt passionately about. And she made royalty attractive again. She understood that it was about display, about catwalk glamour, and about conspicuous expenditure. But there's a problem with that kind of media attention. It's fine when things are going well, but when things are going badly, the photographers don't go away. What the royal family was slow to grasp was that press interest was not grounded in respect for the monarchy. Even the Queen found herself hunted down at Sandringham, and in a moment of rare public anger, had to tell reporters to get lost. The plan of a decade before to show that the royal family was in touch with the people had backfired. They were a bit too in touch with ordinary life, and consequently not so royal. The Queen, and this has been a pattern throughout her reign, found solace in thinking about her less critical subjects overseas.
After she'd broadcast a controversial Christmas message about world poverty, the Queen was accused of caring more about the Commonwealth than about Britain. Even the new Tories, the Thatcherites, took the view that the monarchy was marginal to serious politics. Which left what? Just being celebrities?
It did seem that way, as the marriage of Charles and Diana began to unravel, and the Windsors were becoming synonymous with public humiliation. To the royal family, the press must have appeared like some great ravening beast. There was talk that the monarchy simply couldn't sustain this regular bombardment.
And this sentiment was whipped up further when Diana gave a confessional interview to the BBC Panorama programme. The Windsors, she alleged, were cold, unfeeling people. She came across as as the sacrificial victim in a heartless marriage. The Queen advised divorce. But the event that really tested the relationship between the public and the Queen was the death of Diana herself. The outpouring of grief was universal, spontaneous, and astonishing. Within hours, flowers began to appear at Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace. The people wanted to mourn their princess. By contrast, the reaction from the Queen up in Scotland was decidedly muted. Prince Charles was busy with practical arrangements. He had the unenviable task of telling the two boys that their mother was dead. He decided to fly to Paris to pick up the body. But from the Queen herself, there was no public appearance. She kept to her usual routine. And then there was a statement from the palace saying that the Queen and the Prince of Wales are deeply distressed and shocked at this terrible news. As with Aberfan before, the Queen seemed unable to measure the mood of the public and to reflect it in her own behaviour. Aloof at Balmoral, the Queen was unable to show the human heart of royalty that the people expected. The days went by, the flowers piled up. The Daily Express ran a headline, "Show us you care." But the Queen remained silent. Then, late but not too late, she thought better of it and flew down to London to be here at Buckingham Palace, where she'd make a broadcast to the nation and meet some of the mourners. Some palace officials feared she'd left it so long that she might be barracked or even assaulted. But again, they'd misjudged the public mood. A little girl darted forward, gave her a bunch of flowers. The crowd welcomed her. But suddenly, the royal buzzword was lessons. Lessons would have to be learned. Over the next few years, there was an effort to convey the Queen's caring side, to show the public that she was sensitive to the needs of the nation and willing to accept, even enjoy, her role as figurehead. There was, as a result, general sympathy for the Queen when first her sister and then her mother died. Over 70% of young people today say they support the monarchy. And the mass enthusiasm for the Jubilee celebrations demonstrated that people still want to see their Queen, much as people wanted to see Victoria and George III on their golden jubilees. So what has become of the British monarchy since William the Conqueror's invasion nearly 1,000 years ago? Edward I unified the country by force. Elizabeth I was the most powerful monarch in Europe. Queen Victoria reigned over the most extensive empire in world history. What then of Elizabeth II? Today's Queen is still a great owner of land. She's got her palaces and her courtiers, but not even her most loyal subjects believe that she rules the country. She may be a unifying force for the nation and for the Commonwealth, but politically, she's powerless. There is no monarchy, just a royal family, whose existence can sometimes seem like a long-running soap opera. But it's an institution rightly proud of its rich, almost mythical past, and it's certainly not going to disappear in the foreseeable future.